They tell me she is beautiful, my city, that she is colorful and quaint alone among the cities. But I who have known her tenderness, her courage, and her pity, have felt her forces mold me, mind and bone. Hers are the eyes I look upon life and find it brave and splendid, and the stir of hidden music shaping all my songs, and these, my songs, my all, belong to her.
I'm David Farrow. A generation ago, a friend of mine, Pete Peters, a Charleston videographer, and I produced a video called Charleston, South Carolina, A Magical History Tour. It is being re-released by Hidden Music Productions, LLC, with added scenes and perhaps a different perspective. A whole lot's changed in 25 years, and we've decided to leave the main body of the film alone so that you can actually see what it was like 25 years ago. And you look at it and you say, well, it looks the same. Yeah, but all the people are gone, and all the businesses are gone. It's a different place. In 1978, when I first started giving carriage tours, from right there were 69,000 people in Charleston. There are twice that many people now, and we are one of the fastest growing cities in America. We are growing so fast that we seem to be losing our institutional memory. This is an attempt to kind of preserve it. We filmed this in 1989 and 1990. We thought it would take maybe 6 weeks to film this whole thing. My friend approached me in a bar where I was bartending and said, I'd like to follow you and film your tour. And I said, yeah, and we started not too long later, and we thought we'd all be done in time for Christmas. And then we had a breeze of biblical proportions called Hurricane Hugo. Well, there were a number of videos that were released and a lot of tour videos which featured Hurricane Hugo. My friend Pete Peters and I made the decision at the time not to feature the hurricane at all. And so there is no mention of Hurricane Hugo. However, if you take close looks at it, you'll see where we actually had to film around it. We're very excited to present this to you in a whole digital form. The future isn't coming, it's here, and that's just as true in Charleston, South Carolina, as it is in New York or it is in Mumbai. Things are changing very rapidly. Think of this as a snapshot in time. We hope you enjoy it.
Beautiful. Anyone don't like it here, don't love the Lord.
Walking around Charleston, listen to the history. 320 years ago, a city everyone should see. Carolina people have a different way of doing things. Oh baby, now they say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see. Walking around Charleston, listen to the history. Well, we're bound to appear quite strange at times, but it's the way we'd rather be. Architecture, history, embellishment, and fun. Oh baby now, they say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see.
Hello, I'm David Fowler. I'm a tour guide in the city of Charleston. There have been many videos made about Charleston, but there have been no video tours of Charleston, and we think it's high time there should be one. So we're doing one. Why don't you come along and join us? First thing I want to show you all are the baskets right here, and you can buy these baskets in one of two places in the world, either here in the low country of South Carolina or Angola, Africa. And unless you've got an automatic weapon you're not using, I'd go ahead and try and get them right here. Now you see these ladies making these baskets here in the market. They've been doing this for over 1,000 years, and quite frankly, they're sick of it. No, not those ladies. Olive oil is good, but it's not quite that good. But you see, their mamas taught them how to do it, and their mamas' on back for 1,000 years. And it's kind of sad. It's about to die out because you see, down through the years, the mothers will only teach the daughters, and the daughters don't want to do it anymore. But you got to figure it takes them 2 weeks to make a basket about this large. And what's that? $200. What's that? It's getting so rare that the Smithsonian Institute recently came down here and bought 2 of these baskets for over $1,000. Your tax dollars at work. I, of course, have been trying to get the Smithsonian to take my walking tour for years. Tackle you before you leave.
Okay, all right.
This young lady's been after me. I've known her all my life. She's been after me for 15 years to get married. Right? You think she'd be happy now? I just got married back in April, right? Think she'd be happy? I hope not. She's all right. She wants one other thing. Tell her.
Early in the morning for breakfast. And then I'd be awakened by the shrimp man selling his shrimp. We'd carry on about what's the matter with the lady at 49. She ain't buy from me again this time. Whoa, shrimp, shrimpy, whoa, 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 shrimpy. And then the flower woman with the basket on her head, and she'd say, oh, do God, here come Annie. Annie with the basket on her head. And she would put the basket down on the floor of the piazza, and maid would pick the flowers for the day. Select what she wanted from the basket. And old Annie would carry some kind of cloth on her head so that basket would balance on her top of her lid, her head, her cranium.
You'll see these discs on the buildings. They are earthquake bolts. And you'll be delighted to know that when you come to Charleston, you will be on the second worst earthquake fault in North America. The first is, of course, the San Andreas fault, and we are the Woodstock fault. August 31st, 1886. The bells of St. Michael's Church up ahead rang 3 times to signify it was 9:45 in the evening. It was very quiet, very peaceful, very much like now. 7 minutes later, Charleston, South Carolina, suffered an earthquake estimated to be at least 7.7 on the Richter scale. Man was walking to work. He was editor of the News and Courier. He was walking right here at this intersection. He was going down here to put the paper to bed, and he heard a rumbling behind him, the likes of which he had never heard before. He turned around and watched the street itself buckle at him in waves 10 feet tall. Nobody dared go back into their houses. Everybody lived outside in public parks, in tents, although the people from down below here also brought their oriental rugs, their tea services, and their servants. No need letting a little thing like a natural disaster get in your way. There were 25 aftershocks, lasting over a period of days. An aftershock 2 days later cracked the church in Boston, Massachusetts. It was really the second shock that killed everybody. The first shock came along. Everybody ran outside their house to see what was going on. The second shock came along, and 15,000 chimneys toppled to the ground in the same instant. Less than 30 people were killed outright. Less than 100 people died overall. At the end of it all, 6 houses survived intact.
The damage was so extensive that at first it was thought the only thing we could do was simply just raze the city, tear it down, build a new one. Well, we couldn't afford to. We'd been through a bit of a war back in the 1860s. Many of you may have read something about that. We also had to go through reconstruction, which was devastating. Plus, just to top things off, we had a depression in the 1880s, and a cyclone hit us almost a year to the day before and devastated the city. There was simply no money. So what we had to do was, from the rubble lying on the ground, rebuild the houses, brick by brick, stone by stone, stick by stick, using the original materials just like jigsaw puzzles. So what you see are the original buildings. They're just somewhat rearranged. When everything was ready, they took these long rods and inserted them perpendicular to one another like this, in between each floor of each building. And as you can see, these things have turn bolts on them. As they ever so gradually turned those bolts, the houses, ever so gradually, came back together like this. We don't know how well that's going to work next time. We've had over 200 tremors this year. You don't feel them, though. You'd feel a bus come by here before you felt one. Now, to be honest with you, we are supposed to have another real bad quake within 20,000 years. And God knows I don't sleep at night. But frankly, that has nothing to do with the earthquake. Across the street there is the Mills House Hotel. Now, this is a reproduction of the original Mills House Hotel, which was built in 1851 by Otis Mills. And no, he did not have an uncle named General Mills. Now, this building here was built in 1970 after the original was torn down. However, the balcony and the lanterns are the originals. As a matter of fact, that balcony played a small part in history, because you see, on December 10th, 1861, slaves were frying fish over on a wharf on the Cooper River when the pan they were frying the fish in tipped over, and the hot grease went right into a powder keg. It, of course, exploded, and the subsequent fire cut a swath through the city, a block and a half wide, from the Cooper to the Ashley Rivers, burning everything in its path. Two buildings that burnt down were St. Andrew's Hall over on Broad Street. That's where the ordinances of secession were voted upon, and South Carolina Institute Hall up the street here, and that's where the ordinances of secession were ratified almost a year to the day before. The Mills House, on the other hand, was virtually unscathed, even though it lay in the path of the fire. And I think the reason for that is because a man stood up on that balcony right there and watched that fire sweep across the city. That man's name was Robert E. Lee. You notice the owl up there on top of Hibernian Hall. He's not real. You'd be surprised how many people on my tour ask me if he's real. It's like, what, that owl's in the Marines or something? The building he stands upon is Hibernian Hall. Now, the Hibernian Society itself is an Irish benevolent society, which was chartered back in 1800. The building was built in 1840, and you'll notice the harps, one above the door and one right there in the gate. Those, of course, are the national symbols of Ireland. Now, they still meet on St. Patrick's Day to elect a new president, and how they do this, I'm not really sure, because I've been there. And quite frankly, I've yet to hear one coherent word spoken in that building on St. Patrick's Day. But they managed to do it. One year he's a Catholic, the next year he's a Protestant. And they switch it off back and forth each year. Kind of a shame Northern Ireland couldn't do the same. This is Chalmers Street. This is one of our longest cobblestone streets in the entire city, one of about 8 we have here in the city. And the cobblestones were brought over here as ballast to steady empty British ships as they came over for cotton, rice, and indigo. Now, by the way, we are a living city, one thing that should be pointed out. I used to give carriage tours, and one of the #1 questions we had on the carriages was, do people live in these houses? It's like, no, of course not. Dogs live in these houses. Of course people live in the houses. As a matter of fact, one lady asked me 8 times whether people lived in the houses, and I got so frustrated, I said, no, everything I've told you is an absolute bald-faced lie. Actually, Charleston was built in 1948 by Walt Disney Productions with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. All these are facades. No, of course, people live in the houses. It's a living city. Now, like all living cities, in order to employ half our population each year, we have to tear up our streets. And Chalmers Street here was no exception. Back in 1967, they had to tear the street up to put the electric lines and telephone lines under the street. Well, when they put this section back here, what they did was embedded the stones in cement. And frankly, it looks contrived. The Preservation Society of Charleston was furious. And so when they put this section back right here, what they had to do was number each stone. Take pictures of each section of the street. And when they put the stones back, they put them back literally by the numbers.
This looks like your basic intersection right here, doesn't it? But it's not. This is what is known as the four corners of law. And according to Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not, this is the only intersection in the world where all 4 laws that govern mankind are represented on all 4 corners of the intersection. Right there you've got St. Michael's Episcopal Church. That, of course, is God's law. Over here you've got the federal courthouse, federal law, county courthouse. Over here is state law, and City Hall right here. Now, Charlestonians supposedly have a little rhyme that goes, here you get married, there you get your mail, here you pay your taxes, or there you go to jail. I don't know, man. I've lived here all my life, okay? I've never heard a Charlestonian say that. I think some tour guide made that up back in the 60s. We use it. It's cute. I don't know whether you know this or not, but George Washington came to the city back in 1791. The reason he came to the city, more battles were fought here in South Carolina than any other single place during the Revolutionary War. And when he came here, he worshiped right there at St. Michael's Episcopal Church. Now, of course, George Washington was nothing if he wasn't a politician. And what's the one thing politicians like to do besides steal? They like to talk, don't they? We're going to step out in the middle of the street like insane people, and then we're going to step right back. Now, Washington gave a speech. Right down there, the old Customs and Exchange building. And that's the last building built by the British before the Revolution. It's been used as a customs house, a bank, a post office, a Coast Guard station during World War II, and best of all, a dungeon. And one of the people who stayed in that dungeon back during the Revolution, during the British occupation of Charleston from 1780 to 1782, was a Charlestonian named Isaac Hayne. And despite the protestations of all the prominent citizenry here in the city, the British took Isaac Hayne out 3 separate times to hang him before they finally did. Boy, those British, what a sense of humor, huh? God, what jokesters.
They also had a banquet for George Washington right here in McCrady's Tavern. And that banquet lasted for 2 whole days. God, they had a good time back then. Except for one thing. George Washington did, of course, have wooden teeth. Paul Revere made them for him. I don't know, it could have taken him that long to eat.
The reason I mention all this, if you're ever here during a weekday, go up here to City Hall Chambers. Because inside there's a huge picture of George Washington. See, it was kind of like having the Beatles here. I mean, the town just went berserk. And so the city fathers decided to get a little-known portrait artist named John Trumbull to paint a portrait of George Washington for them. And I bet you've seen it. Because in it, Washington's standing very tall like this. He's got his hand on his hip like this. He's got a hat in his hand like this. He's holding onto a scepter like this. He's looking out like this. Very visionary, very stern. There's a horse rearing behind him. And the Battle of Trenton is raging below. Like I said, you've probably seen that picture. It's in a lot of history books. That picture hangs in Yale University. The city fathers said, no, we don't want it. It doesn't have Charleston in it. And quite frankly, Mr. Trumbull, we're not going to pay you. until you give us a picture with Charleston in it. Trumbull said, okay, fine. Had to get Washington to come back and stand for another portrait. He was furious, but he did it. And in the one that hangs in here, in City Hall, Washington standing very tall like this. He's got his hand on his hip like this, okay? He's holding on to a scepter like this still. He's still looking out like this. He's still very visionary, still very father of our country-ish. But he's smiling. Not a full smile, but his eyes. Look at his eyes. His eyes are smiling. The horse is still in the picture. He's been turned around. His tail is up. His legs are splayed. He's about to make an obvious social statement. And a direct line from where that statement is to be made are St. Michael's Episcopal Church, where Washington worshiped, the Customs House down the street from whence he spoke, and still in that straight line, the City Fathers rowing over to meet George Washington in Mount Pleasant. The only comment ever made was that that picture looked remarkably, just remarkably like George Washington. All right, this right here, this is the South Carolina Society Hall. Now, the society itself was started back in 1737 as the Two Bits Club. And it was called the Two Bits Club because every time a French Huguenot went into a tavern, he had to place 2 bits into a jar. And when the jar got full, they'd give it to the widows and orphans here in the city. We're wonderful people. I had to go to dancing school in here. 3 years of cotillion dancing school. What a nightmare. What an awful thing to do to a child. My kids are going. That was for debutante balls, though, see? I was on the list till I was 30. And then I think they kind of figured out that all I was doing was really just drinking all their liquor and looking down their daughters' dresses. So it was kind of like, okay, you're out of here, right? Now, what's funny is that now I'm a newlywed, right? So I'm back on the list. 3 years of dancing school, right? 3 years of it.
Did it work?
I can foxtrot now. Where? With whom? All right, right there you got number 4 Trad Street, right? And right there you got number 2 Trad Street, right? Big deal. So what? Except for one thing. You've got another door. What are you going to do? There's frankly only one thing you can do. Number 0 Trad Street. Right here you got number 1 Trad Street. You've got another door. What are you going to do? 1/2 Trad Street. There's a footnote for you, though. The people that now live at number 0 Trad Street moved there from number 0 Kid Street. That is Vandross Row. You want to do me a favor and spell that for me? Come on, give it a try.
Go ahead. You're smarter than I am. V-A-N-D-R-O-S-S.
V-A-N-D-E-R-H-O-R-S-T. Vandross. Now I want you to go ahead and pronounce these for me, okay? H-A-S-E-L-L. Hazel. Hazel. All right. Here, I'll give you a gimme. C-O-O-P-E-R.
Cooper.
What? Cooper. Yeah, very Cooper. Yeah. O-G-I-E-R. Ogier. Ogier. Yeah. H-U-G-E-R. Wager? U-G.
U-G.
L-E-G-A-R-E. No, I just told you that. What was it?
Legree?
Legree, right. It's been said if a Charlestonian were to buy a dog and name it Fido, he'd have to spell it P-H-A-E-D-E-A-U-X. Fido. Especially in Charleston, probably the most unusual thing we have here in South Carolina are the liquor laws. We do have liquor by the drink, but we have it in mini bottles. Now, I am here in Lewis's Bar and Grill in the Omni in downtown Charleston. This is Mr. Paul Pelham, the manager of Lewis's Bar and Grill, and what he's doing right there, he is pouring me a cocktail. And this is what we've got. Now, you can think of the entire state as being one rather large airliner, because every time you buy a cocktail in South Carolina, the state's taking you for a ride.
Good afternoon, David. Would you join me for a drink inside, please?
Well, certainly will. Love to do it. We Charlestonians, we like to have a cocktail or 10.
Right.
We're all Episcopalians, and in the South we're called whiskey-payans.
And the reason for that is, the joke in the South is every time you see an Episcopalian, every time you see 4 Episcopalians, you're sure to find a 5th. And Mr. Burniston Baker right here, of course he wouldn't know anything about it from first-hand experience, but he grew up during the Blind Tiger era. And Burniston, what were you saying earlier about back before the Depression, before actually Prohibition? Right.
Certainly Charleston had a number of blind tigers. And in most cases, they were corner grocery stores run by newcomers to Charleston, you might say. The immigrants that went into the grocery business had these grocery stores on these corners, and the working class of people needed a place to drink, as well as the upper crust, so to speak. The upper crust went to their private clubs and purchased drinks across the bar. Well, the working class needed a place to drink, so these blind tigers were basically used by them, and in a lot of instances they were grocery stores where a working class man at the end of a hard day's toil could go into these grocery stores, and for 15 cents or a quarter he would be dispensed a shot of his favorite brown beverage, be it bourbon, scotch, etc. I can't say that I personally saw this being done, but these are the stories that were related to me, David, and it goes back, it comes from my father, grandfather, etc., who were all incidentally drinking people.
Well, now, what about during Prohibition? How'd that work?
During Prohibition, there again, whiskey was rather hard to come by. The area of Charleston which I lived, with the dowagers and the drinking class of Episcopalians, which I am a member of, we had bootleggers who had a heyday, but the bootleggers could not be contacted by the downtown Charlestonians, and particularly the dowager women. So they would have a compatriot from downtown, a ne'er-do-well person at times, who would be the contact between the bootlegger and them. They would give the downtown acquaintance of theirs an order for booze, and he would go and deal with the bootleggers and deliver it, if you will, to each of these dowagers' homes.
Well, without mentioning names, you were talking before we started all this, and you were talking about a gentleman, a ne'er-do-well, as it were.
A ne'er-do-well, the one I have in mind, happened to be a member of one of our oldest societies, the Census City. And he came by hard times, so to supplement his meager income, he became a go-between, if you will, between the bootlegger and the consumers from downtown Charleston.
Getting a cut.
That's certainly making a profit.
A finder's fee, as it were.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Well, now, after Prohibition, of course, it was still illegal. Liquor by the drink was still illegal.
And Charleston being had some beautiful places for tourists. That was in the days back in the 20s and 30s when we, so to speak, had the rich tourists. It was about the time that Yeoman's Hall was starting to be founded. We had the Villa Margarita, the Calhoun Mansion, which catered to the rich, if you will, the rich northern tourist. And we had the DuPonts, the Vanderbilts, who all wintered here. They stayed at the Villa Margarita, and the Calhoun Mansion took care of the overrun, if you will, from the villa. But Barbara Hutton stayed here for winter after winter at the villa and took their meals there. Well, that class of person wanted their drinks at night, so the villa, regardless of Prohibition, supplied them with their wants. Prohibition was tough on us, but again, Charleston's a seacoast town, and we had the Navy here, and we had merchant ships coming in, and after a hard 2 months at sea, those fellas, when they hit town, wanted some pleasure, and drinking liquor is a pleasure, so they were supplied with whiskey. So all doing Prohibition, so to speak, the state law enforcement agencies sort of took a dim view of Charleston. They did not enforce the laws to the nth degree with us. And on into the 30s and the 40s and 50s and 60s, Charleston, contrary to the state law, served liquor by the drink poured out of a fifth, or fifth in those days. There were no liters or quarts, so they used fifths, 4 pints, half pints, if you will. And there were numerous establishments where you could go in and purchase a drink across the bar just like you can in any other northern city. And the law enforcement agencies sort of looked the other way.
Well, Schuyler Parsons was one of these wealthy Northerners that would come to Charleston in the wintertime to escape the intemperate climate up there. He came to Charleston, he liked what he saw, and he actually ended up sort of going into the antique business here. But he'd been a famous host, entertaining at his mansion on Long Island, been up and down the eastern seaboard, and he pretty much said that the first time he ever encountered cocktail parties was in the city of Charleston in the 1920s and 30s, and he couldn't figure out why. And then he actually started to think about it, and he realized it was actually Charleston's major institution, the 3 o'clock dinner, that was really responsible for that. Charlestonians historically eating the main meal about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy meal, and then about 5 o'clock or so, Charleston hostesses sending their maids home. So if they wanted to entertain at night, they weren't used to doing dinner parties or anything like that. So with no one there to help them serve or to cook at night, these Charleston hostesses, entertaining these people at evening, would have their maids or their cooks possibly prepare a ham or something like that, something that they could serve cold, which they could leave out on the tables as sort of a buffet and not actually have a sit-down dinner. And they would serve the alcohol. So it would be a stand-up affair. People would be coming around having drinks and just having niblets. And going all across the eastern seaboard at this time, Schuyler Parsons says the cocktail party actually begins in the city of Charleston sometimes in the 1920s.
I would also argue that since we invented it, you go to most cocktail parties and they've got those ridiculous plastic plates that you put 4 shrimp on. No, we graze.
Oh yeah.
And people say that we're rude, but I would say, no, we started it.
People do really complain about coming to Charleston cocktail parties and only being napkins there and not having plates. And people that have come from other places are kind of appalled by that, but you're absolutely right. People graze at Charleston cocktail parties.
Charleston, you're going to see a rather odd piece of architecture. You're going to see what is known as a Charleston single house. They are 1 single room wide. The porches face south, and the doors open onto the porch. It's the most prevalent style of architecture here in the city. Now, tour guide lore has it that they're 1 single room wide because Charlestonians were taxed on their frontage. I don't think that's true. I've looked around for it. I can find nothing to prove that it is. What I think is when the original city was laid out, the city planners built the lots deep so you could get more houses on the street. Now, the porches always face either south or west. And they got the idea from the prevailing sea breezes. The sea breezes come from the south and the west, and that theoretically is supposed to cool down the house. If you live here in July and you don't have air conditioning, that is questionable. Now, of course, the door is there for privacy. Another aspect of a single house is the north wall. Now, take a good look at this north wall. What can you tell me about it? What's there? Or rather, what's not there? There's a dearth of windows. That's because it was extremely rude to look out of your north window. You might look onto your neighbor's south porch, and he could well be undressed. Now, of course, their idea of being undressed is a lot different from our idea of being undressed. Their idea was simply to take off your top coat, not your suit coat. Your top coat. Can you imagine in July having to wear a top coat? No wonder those men died young. And think about the ladies, if you would, with their hoop skirts, their 15 layers of petticoats, and their whalebone corsets. No wonder those women were dropping like flies. I've always thought that hoop skirts really were kind of a rip-off for men. I mean, of course, you didn't see your wife before you married her. What if on your wedding night, you found out that it wasn't a hoop skirt?
This is the site of the Granville Bastion. Now, this is the southeast corner of the Charleston Wall. Now, we were a walled city, just like Quebec Montreal, or St. Augustine. It was built to keep out the French, Spanish, and Indians. It did a wonderful job, and except for one thing, we grew very quickly back then, and the only way in and out of the wall was a drawbridge at the four corners of Law, where that is today. So think about it. Here's the wall, or better yet, let's do this. Here's the wall. You lived here. You wanted to go here. You had to go all the way around the city, back through the city, just to get next door. So eventually they tore it down because it was hindering commerce. Notice this. Look down here. We have just walked out of the wall. We have just walked outside of the wall. You can see how everything thus far has been just flush. And then look down here where it's relatively spread apart because of the wall. We just walked out of the walled city. This is the studio of Elizabeth O'Neill Werner. She was an amazing woman. Did her first art at the age of 5, her last at the age of 87 years old. And this is her lovely daughter, Mrs. Betty Hamilton.
He goes around and says, makes fun of this business of my young friend, and all kinds of sarcastic things like that, but I'm very bad. Mother went to a very good art school, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and that's where she learned how to do the hands and the feet and the shoulder blades of all these wonderful people. Up until the time she started them, almost every representative of the Negro were caricatures, stick out lips and ugly knees, and, or just lay figures. But Mother saw them as individuals and worked very, very hard to make friends and have these people pose for her. And she has done really a magnificent representation of the Gullah, South Carolina Negro with their simplicity and their sweetness and their humor. And they're lovely people, and you can see it all. Now, if you'll just wait 1 second, I will show you something marvelous. This is a man named Cyrus, and he had come from the welfare and was posing, but he didn't know what the lady wanted. And look at his eyes, look at the humor around his mouth, and his puzzled expression. He's a real person, you know very much what he's like. And this is what Mother considered her best work, her interpretation of these black people.
They call this Catfish Row right here. This is not Catfish Row. Catfish Row is fictional, and had Catfish Row existed, it would be where Rainbow Row is today. No, that's Cabbage Row. And the reason they call it Cabbage Row is because back at the turn of this century, over 100 people lived in this building. One of the people, they grew cabbages in the back, see, and they sell them up front. That's why it's called Cabbage Row. One of the people who lived on Cabbage Row at the turn of this, in the 20s, a little black man named Sammy Smalls. And Sammy Smalls was a cripple. He used to ride around Charleston on a goat cart selling vegetables and, frankly, stealing anything he could get his hands on. Not a very savory character at all. Miss Hamilton knew him. My mother knew him, as a matter of fact. Matter of fact, they had a guy on television not too long ago, John Gibbs, a lawyer, say, "Yeah, you know, when I was a child, I used to see Sam Smalls everywhere I went. Man, you'd see him come up and down the street on that goat cart, and I swear to God to you, when he got close to you, you could never tell which one smelled worse, the goat or Sam Smalls." Well, one afternoon, Sam Smalls shot his girlfriend. And a man, big trial and everything, and a man named DuBose Hayward wrote a book about it, called it Porgy. DuBose Hayward and George Gershwin, together right here on Folly Beach, wrote the first American operetta, Porgy and Bess.
One oddity you'll see here in Charleston also is the Hat Man on the corner of Broad and Church Streets. You got to take a close look at him. He's made completely out of hats. Eyes, ears, nose. Everything but his cane and his umbrella here are hats. They discovered him back in the 30s. They were sandblasting the building. Well, they found him, and they found the color scheme upstairs, and they repainted him, and he's been back here for over 50 years. But he was put here originally in the 1870s. Take a look at his ears. One's a Union hat, the other's a Confederate hat. Well, the guy who owned the hat shop here in the 1870s said, look, he didn't care. He'd sell a hat to anybody who came into his shop. But we here in Charleston, of course, say that the poor little hat man is deaf in one ear. Of course, I'm not sure which ear,
You'll notice throughout this entire tour, I've been calling that conflict back in the 1860s the wall. Now, Yankees are quick to call that conflict what? Civil War, right? That's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? I mean, Civil War, what does that imply? That implies one nation, two or more factions, right? No, we were two separate nations. Plus, frankly, there was nothing civil about that war. Now, of course, if you're from the South, as y'all are, you call that conflict what? The war between the states, or actually just the wall will suffice, right? I mean, come on, man. How many Southerners do you think sit around and say, yeah, well, you know, my great-granddaddy did that during the war? Have another Southerner say, oh, which war is that, Bill? Now, if you're from Charleston, you call it either the late unpleasantness, which is what my great-grandmother called it, the Second War of Independence, or, of course, the ever-popular, ever-succinct War of Northern Aggression. And that's all I like that. This is a Dock Street Theater. And this is the oldest theater in North America still used as a theater. 1735. Now the building burnt down in the early 1800s. And they replaced it the next year. And for a long time, this was a Planters Inn hotel. You ever had a Planters Punch? Well, I'm told that's where it started. Now in 1935, 200 years to the day, hour, minute, that they opened us as a theater, they reopened it as a theater with exactly the same play. The Recruiting Officer. I don't think they had the same players. But if they did, they sure as hell knew their lines, didn't they? This is the oldest active French Huguenot church in this country. And you know why? It's the only active French Huguenot church in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's kind of funny why this is back to being a French Huguenot church. This is not the official version, I might add. This is my version, but it's true. This lay fallow for many years. You had a couple of old ladies who would come in here and worship without benefit of clergy. And they just, you know, they kept it up, but they didn't have services every Sunday and that kind of thing. Now, it was originally called the Church of Tides or the High Tide Church, and that's because the water came right up to around here. Hence the name Dock Street for Dock Street Theater. Now, in 1719, we did something darned unusual for this town. We seceded. Yeah, we did. We seceded 4 times. And we kicked the Lord's proprietors right out. And we ruled ourselves for about 14 years. Trouble is, England wouldn't trade with us, nor would they protect us. So after about 14 years, we kind of came back to England and said, all right, we're sorry, all right? We'll be a colony. But during that 14 years, they changed many of the laws, and one of the laws that they changed was you had to go to church. You had to go to church. If you didn't, they'd put you in jail. A lot of people would be serving life sentences now, wouldn't they? Well, the Huguenots, there was no road system. So in the beginning, the Huguenots had to come down from the plantations. And of course, the only way they could get down was by boat. The only way they could get their boats into the creek was at high tide. So the church had to schedule the services each week around high tide. Now later on, much of this area over here was built because they got tired of, waiting around. So they built houses so they could come in. And later on, they became townhouses for the plantations. Now this is indeed St. Philip's Episcopal Church, and this is the oldest congregation south of Virginia. They claim 1670, but you see, they didn't get a minister until 1681. Now, the minister they got in 1681 was quite a guy. The last thing he did as minister of this parish was to get drunk as hell and baptize a bear cub. Talked about Huguenots throughout this entire tour, and now it's time we have you meet an actual Huguenot. This is Mrs. Jeanne Eugene Franklin.
Bon après-midi. I am a Huguenot, and it is indeed a pleasure to know and meet you through the press. This house was built in 1757. This area is the French area. We're now entering my residence. It has the same entranceway that it originally had, a new door, of course. It was heated by fireplaces. We're now entering my residence. It belonged to the Rainier family, who came here from France During the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, this was a large drawing room and has remained that. Smaller, of course. The garden outside, very pleasant to see and sit in during the season. These trees out here are tetrapanax trees. They come from Yunnan province, China. The garden I found that the Reyniers and other Huguenots had many rare plants brought by them from France, particularly the nice herbs that you can eat. They were industrious. They made many wonderful dishes and planting gardens so that they could have their fresh vegetables. They valued fresh vegetables and fresh food very much and prepared it as often as it was prepared in France. They were very, very helpful to those that were coming over because there were still people being persecuted who needed a place to go, and they would take them in and look after them and help them as best that they could. They were a great asset to what this land has become because they were loyal people and cared. They protected the things that they had. The church was their great love, and they took beautiful care of it, and the services were very interesting. They had an annual service every year, which was in the spring, to be certain that they'd gotten through the past winter and gone through to the spring. They were thanking the Lord for that, and they had what they called a reception with a collation. Usually that was done out in the country. They trekked out to the woods to where other markings of the French were, other little churches, other graveyards, and left flowers and plants there, and just generally looked at the scenery that they had become to love a great deal. They still, to this day, have an annual service every year in the French church. Now that service is given in French. French was the only language spoken in the church from the beginning until about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little longer, and then they had to have English services. So they reserve 1 day a year in the French church to have a service similar, using, of course, the Huguenot liturgy. It's still there, a copy of books that we've got, the original book from which the other prayer books were copied. The first one was built in 1680. They were rice planters, and they knew how to plant rice and plant it well and make the crops yield abundance of rice, the staple diet of the southern part of South Carolina, the low country as it was called. We are here. We will continue to be here. We will leave our mark as we have with our lovely little church on the corner of Queen and Church Street.
We're here at the market. All of this land was originally a huge tidal creek, the largest tidal creek in the entire city. Now it was Daniels Creek, and that tidal creek ran along the northernmost border of the Charleston Wall. Now you may have wondered what happened to the wall. Well, I'm walking right on top of it. That's what filled in Daniels Creek. That was in 1728. In 1788, all of this land was donated to the city of Charleston by the Pinckney family, the signers of the Constitution. And they could have this land forever under 2 stipulations. One, that this always remain a public market. Mind you, if you get a chance to walk through here, you realize they said nothing about the bounds of good taste. 2, that no slave ever be sold on this land. No, what it was literally a meat market. You can see the ram's heads and the steer's heads up there around Market Hall. Now, what they would do originally was they would take a whole steer right there. All the scraps in the street, right here, which you would think might get a tad rank now and then, especially, say, in July or August. But you see, it didn't, because there were a bunch of turkey buzzards that sat up on the roofs here. And the turkey buzzards would swoop down and eat all of the refuse. Now, any city that has to call a swimming pool a fish pond cannot call a buzzard a buzzard. No, we had to call them Charleston Eagles. So I guess you could really say the first Eagle snacks were here too.
I tried to give you all an impression of the city. I hope I've done it. One thing I haven't done is the accent. And that's because I lived up in New York for 8 months. I lived in D.C. for 6 years, and I don't know, I just lost the accent. It comes back late at night sometimes. I've never understood that. It's called Gullah, G-U-L-L-A-H, Gullah. Now, you heard the white version of it when I was talking about Sam Smalls. That was a white version. This is a black. Man was walking down the street and he was trying to find the market, and he'd been looking for hours. He couldn't find it anywhere. God, he'd been looking for hours. He couldn't find it. And finally he came upon an old black gentleman. The guy was gardening, minding his own business. The guy walks up to him and kind of kicks him and says, "Hey, where's the market?" The guy looks up and sees he's a tourist and kind of smiles and says, "Oh, you got, yes, sir. What you got to do? You go straight up the street right here. You got to go 3 blocks and take a right. Then you got to go 3 more blocks and take a right. You go 3 more blocks and take a right. And 3 more blocks and take a right. Then you be right back where you is right now, and that ain't right." "No, sir. What you got to do? You go straight up the street here. You got to keep on going up the street here. You keep on going up here and going up here and going up here till you get to Calhoun Street. Then you got to go 10 block past there, and you got to take a left, and then you be on the other state, and then you be in Columbia before you know him. Ain't nobody want to be in Columbia, so no, that ain't right neither. No, sir. No, sir, I tell you, sorry, but I ain't think you could get there from here." Charlestonians have often been compared to the ancient Chinese. That's kind of berserk, isn't it? Well, what the hell do we have in common? Chinese people, huh? Well, I'll tell you what, stop and think. It's not that strange. We eat lots of rice. We worship our ancestors. And some even say that we speak in a foreign tongue. Thanks. We hope you enjoyed this video. Now what you should do is come on down to Charleston and enjoy the real thing.
Walking around Charleston, listen to the history. Years ago, a city everyone should see. Carolina people have a different way of doing things. Oh, baby, now they say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see. Walking around Charleston, listen to the history. Where we're bound to appear quite strange at times, but it's the way we'd rather be. Architecture, history, embellishment, and fun. Oh, baby, now they say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see. Taking off on a vacation soon with your family in a car and in a room. Find yourself in old Charleston on a walking tour, having fun. Well, they say there's no place quite like this where you can see everything and there's nothing you'll miss. They say these things for us to see. They say these things for us to see. Some say she's a friendly city, there's no place I'd rather be. Southern charm will twist your arm and tell you how they be. Carolina people have a different way of doing things.
Probably one of my favorite stories in that whole tour was the story about the Gullah Man. And I told that story for 25, 30 years. Now, I didn't give tours for about 10 years, from about 1999 to about 2009. Things had changed a great deal while I was gone. I started to tell that story and got complaints because I wasn't culturally sensitive. Really? I actually started the ghost tour here in Charleston, the first regularly scheduled ghost tour called Doctor to the Dead. And so I took one of the stories from Doctor to the Dead and put it at the end of the tour to substitute it for the Gullah story. And this is how it went. A little over 100 years ago, two guys moved in together and lived together for a good 10 years. You could do that back then. No one would talk. And everything was going fine until they were about 40 years old. Now, one of these men was a very skinny man. The other was a rather big, strapping sort of fellow. And the skinny man gets sick. And so, since it was the big man's best friend, the big man felt an obligation to take care of his friend, the skinny man. Finally, when they're about 60, the strapping man gets home after a hard day of work. Comes home and he starts to cook dinner, and the skinny man looks up from his bed and he says, "You know, John, I feel absolutely horrible.
I feel so bad. God, I wish I could die."
But the strapping man kind of picks up a little bit and says, "Is that right? You know, if you call death, he'll come." The skinny man kind of looks at him and says, "Wait a minute, man. What are you saying?" He says, "No, really, if you call death, he'll come." "Where'd you read that?" "No, honestly, go ahead. God, just try it for me, okay?" "Well, okay." Skinny man gets up on his elbows like this, and he looks up at the ceiling and he says, "Death, please, come." John, that didn't seem, no, well, you're not doing it. Now this time, I want you to really concentrate. I want you to really get into it, all right? Okay. Death, please, come. John just said, "No, man, you're not doing it right, all right? Now this time, really concentrate, damn it. Just, come on." God, all right. "Death, please, come." John, I swear, he's, no, you're not doing it right. That's not how you do it. This is how you do it. Death, please, come. Skinny Man lived another 20 years. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the tour. And this is not the end. This is just the beginning. I'm David Farron.